There's a certain kind of winter that modern life has almost made us forget. A winter where warmth wasn't a given, but a hope. Where the cold moved through a house as easily as the wind outside, settling into walls, floors, and even the quiet spaces between breaths. Imagine a world where cold was not an inconvenience but a constant companion, where breath turned to mist indoors, and where the battle against winter was fought room by room, hour by hour, with nothing but coal, ash, and human endurance. Tonight, we drift back to Victorian Britain, to the narrow streets of Manchester and London's East End, where fog mixed with soot and daylight came thin and pale through industrial haze. We'll step into homes that shivered, into lives that moved slowly through the cold, and into a world where warmth was earned, rationed, and sometimes altogether absent. Before we begin this quiet passage through the coal-dusted chill of the 1870s, I have a small request. If you'd like to join me on more of these slow journeys through history's forgotten corners, tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History. It helps us continue these late-night wanderings together. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are right now, what time it is where you're listening. Some of you might be settling into the stillness of midnight, others just waking to morning light, and some drifting somewhere in between. Now, let the room around you grow a little dimmer. Perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soft, steady hum in the background, and let's step together into the cold. The year is 1874, and winter has settled over the narrow row houses of Manchester like a weight that will not lift. You live here in a cramped dwelling pressed between others just like it, on a street where the fog never fully clears, and the smell of coal smoke hangs in the air like a permanent tenant. Your home is 2 rooms stacked one atop the other, connected by a staircase so narrow your shoulders brush both walls as you climb. The walls are thin brick, cracked in places where the plaster has given up, and there is no insulation to speak of, just cold stone and damp mortar holding back the world outside. The only source of heat in your home is a single iron grate set into the wall of the lower room, a blackened thing with a gaping mouth that swallows coal and gives back so little warmth it sometimes feels like mockery. When the wind shifts, smoke escapes back into the room, stinging your eyes and coating everything in a fine grey dust that settles on the table, the windowsill, the blankets folded in the corner. Damp rises from the floorboards, creeping up the walls in dark patches that never dry. You've learned to recognize the smell, a heavy, earthy scent mixed with mildew, and the faint sweetness of rot. The dampness has its own geography, its own territories within your home. In the corner farthest from the grate, where the outer wall meets the floor, the moisture has claimed complete victory. The plaster there is soft to the touch, crumbling like wet chalk when you press against it. At night, your breath becomes visible the moment you exhale, little clouds that hang in the air for just a moment before dissolving into the cold. The sheets feel like they've been stored outside, stiff and icy against your skin, and the pillow offers no comfort. It's as cold as everything else. Sometimes you place your clothes beneath the blankets at night, hoping your body heat will warm them by morning. It never works as well as you hope. They're marginally less frigid when you pull them on, but the improvement is barely noticeable. Your coal supply sits in a small wooden box near the hearth, never quite full, always running lower than you'd like. Each piece is precious, rationed carefully, because the coal dealer raises his prices every winter and you can never afford as much as you need. You've learned to recognize the different qualities of coal by sight, the glossy black chunks that burn longest and hottest, the dusty fragments that catch quickly but die fast, the slate-grey pieces mixed with stone that barely burn at all. When the dealer delivers your order, you sift through it with your hands, knowing you'll find too much of the worthless grey and not enough of the good black. Lighting the fire each morning is a ritual of frustration and patience. The kindling is often damp from the moisture that seeps into everything, and coaxing a flame from yesterday's dead embers requires kneeling on the cold floor, blowing gently until your lungs ache and your face feels scorched while your back remains frozen. Sometimes the embers are completely dead, nothing but cold grey ash that crumbles when you touch it. On these mornings, you must start from nothing: a match, a twist of newspaper, a prayer that the damp kindling will catch. You wake before sunrise always, because the factory bell waits for no one and the walk is long. The room is so cold that getting out of bed feels like plunging into icy water. Your body stiffens, your joints protest, and for a few moments you wonder if you can bear it. But you do, because you always do. You swing your legs out from under the thin blankets, and your feet meet the floor with a shock that travels up through your bones. The transition from sleep to waking is never gentle in winter. Your body fights against it, curling tighter under the covers, seeking any excuse to remain where it is for just a few moments longer. The water jug on the washstand is sometimes frozen, a thin layer of ice across the surface that you have to crack with your knuckles. When it's not frozen, it's still cold enough to make you gasp when you splash it on your face. You've learned to wash quickly, in sections, face first, then hands, then neck, never exposing too much skin to the air at once. The cold makes you clumsy, your fingers stiff and uncooperative as you fumble with buttons and laces. Your clothes never fully dry from the day before. Dampness from rain, from sweat, from the general wetness of everything lingers in the fabric. Pulling them on feels like wrapping yourself in cold rags, but they're all you have, so you do it quickly and try not to think about it. The wool of your coat has absorbed so much moisture over the weeks that it's grown heavy, weighing on your shoulders like a burden made physical. When you move, you can smell it. That particular scent of wet wool mixed with coal smoke and sweat that marks everyone in your neighborhood as belonging to the same struggling class. The children, if you have them, huddle together in the corner of the room, silent and waiting. They've learned not to complain about the cold. It doesn't help, and it only makes the morning feel longer. Their faces in the dim pre-dawn light are pale and pinched, their eyes too large and too knowing for their ages. They watch you work at the fire with a patience that seems unnatural in children, but hunger and cold teach patience faster than any parent could. You shuffle to the hearth and begin the slow process of building a fire. A handful of coal, a twist of paper, a few splinters of wood if you're lucky. The technique matters more than you ever expected when you first came to this house. You've learned through trial and error how to stack the kindling just so, how to place the coal to catch the flame without smothering it, how to angle the paper to catch the draft from the chimney without being pulled up into it. The flame catches eventually, and for a few precious moments the room begins to warm, or at least the space directly in front of the grate does. The rest of the room remains untouched, cold air pressing in from every corner. You position the children near the fire, letting them absorb what warmth they can before you leave. Their small hands stretch toward the flames, turning pink as blood returns to fingers that moments ago were white with cold. By the time the fire is burning steadily, you have to leave. The warmth you worked so hard to create will die while you're gone, the embers fading to ash long before you return. It feels like waste every time, this expenditure of precious coal for heat that no one will benefit from for most of the day. But the alternative, leaving the children in a house with no fire at all, is unthinkable, so you bank the coals carefully and hope they'll last long enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. The walk to work takes you through frost-covered streets where every breath hurts your lungs, and the cold finds its way through every layer of clothing. The shock of leaving the barely warm house and stepping into the frozen morning is something you never quite get used to. Your body recoils, your shoulders hunch, your hands curl into fists inside your pockets. The streets are cobbled with stones that grow slick with frost, each step requiring careful attention to avoid a fall. You've seen men slip and break bones, unable to work for weeks afterward, their families plunged into even deeper poverty by the loss of income. Other people move along the same streets, all of them hunched the same way, all of them silent. There's nothing to say, everyone knows what the morning feels like. Sometimes you pass the same faces every day, a wordless companionship forming between people who share the same route, the same schedule, the same struggle. A nod of acknowledgement perhaps, but rarely more. Speaking requires opening your mouth, and opening your mouth means letting the cold in. The factory, when you finally reach it, is a study in contrasts. The rooms where the machinery runs are blisteringly hot, filled with the roar of engines and the suffocating press of steam and sweat. The heat hits you like a wall when you first step inside, so sudden and overwhelming that your body doesn't know how to respond. Your frozen skin burns as it warms too quickly, and within minutes you're sweating, your clothes clinging to you with a different kind of dampness. But the storage rooms, the hallways, the spaces between the heat, these are as cold as the street outside. You move between these extremes throughout the day, your body never quite adjusting, always too hot or too cold, never comfortable. The constant shifting between temperatures leaves you perpetually dizzy, your body unable to regulate itself properly. By midday, you've learned to predict the waves of nausea that come from moving too quickly from the hot machinery room to the cold loading dock. The heat in the machinery rooms is oppressive, thick and wet, clinging to your skin and soaking through your clothes. But when you step away even for a moment, the cold rushes back in and the sweat on your body turns icy. You've seen people collapse from the heat, carried out to the cold hallway where they shiver and gasp, their bodies confused and overwhelmed. You've learned to pace yourself, to take small steps into the cold rather than rushing, to give your body a moment to adjust before plunging back into the heat. You manage your warmth with layers, a scarf wrapped tight, a cap pulled low, an extra shirt beneath your coat if you have one. But no amount of layering can keep out the drafts that slip through every crack and seam. The machinery creates its own wind, great gusts that blow through the factory floor, carrying heat in some places and cold in others. You learn where to stand, where to work, where to position yourself to benefit from the warm currents while avoiding the cold ones. Your fingers grow numb, then ache, then grow numb again. Your toes disappear inside your boots, sensationless until you move them, and the tingling starts. The numbness is almost welcome compared to the pain that comes when feeling returns. The ache spreads through your hands like fire, a burning sensation that makes you want to cry out, but you don't, because everyone else is enduring the same thing, and making noise about it would only mark you as weak. When the work is finally done, and you step back out into the evening, the sun has already set. The walk home is darker, colder, and longer than the walk there. The darkness amplifies everything. The cold feels colder, the distance feels farther, the exhaustion settles deeper into your bones. The few gas lamps along your route cast circles of weak yellow light that seem to emphasize the darkness beyond them rather than pushing it back. You know that when you open the door to your house, you'll be greeted by the same cold you left behind. The fire you lit that morning is long dead, the room just as frozen as it was when you woke. The children, if they're old enough to be left alone, have usually managed to rekindle a small flame from the banked coals. If they're too young, they'll be huddled together in the corner, wrapped in every blanket in the house, waiting for you to bring warmth back into their world. You go through the ritual again, kneeling, blowing, coaxing a reluctant flame from damp kindling and precious coal. This time, at least, you can stay near it. The evening fire feels different from the morning one, perhaps because you know you'll be able to enjoy it, to sit close enough that your face grows hot while your back stays cold. This is your time, these few hours between work and sleep, when the fire burns and the day's labor is done. The coal dealer is a figure everyone in your neighborhood knows by reputation and resentment. In the summer, when no one needs him, his prices are almost reasonable. But when winter arrives and the cold presses in, his prices climb. He knows you have no choice. Without coal, you freeze. He's a large man with a perpetually red face, whether from the cold or from drink no one quite knows. His cart rattles through the streets twice a week, the sound of it recognizable from blocks away, iron wheels on cobblestones, the jingle of the horse's harness, and that particular hollow sound of coal shifting in wooden bins. You've learned to stretch your supply, burning less than you need, letting the fire die earlier than you'd like, waking to a house that feels like a tomb. Some nights you go to bed with no fire at all, piling every blanket you own onto the mattress and hoping your body heat will be enough. On these nights, sleep is elusive. You lie awake in the darkness, shivering, listening to the wind outside and wondering if you've made the right choice, if saving coal for tomorrow is worth the suffering of tonight. Coal dust covers everything. It settles on the table where you eat, on the windowsill where you rest your elbows, on the blankets where you sleep. You can feel it on your skin, a fine grit that never quite washes away. It works its way into your pores, under your fingernails, into the creases of your knuckles, until your hands look permanently dirty, no matter how much you scrub them. You cough it up sometimes, black flecks in your spit, a reminder that the air you breathe is never clean. Your neighbors complain about it too in quiet voices, as if speaking too loudly might make it worse. The old ones cough more than anyone else, deep, rattling sounds that shake their whole bodies. Everyone knows what that cough means, knows where it leads, but no one speaks of it directly, because what would be the point? The coal must be burned, the air must be breathed, and the consequences are simply part of life. Sometimes a neighbor will share a bit of kindling or pass along a handful of leftover cinders from their own fire. These small acts of generosity are never acknowledged with much fanfare, just a nod, a quiet thank you, a mutual understanding that everyone is struggling. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down once brought you a bundle of wood scraps her son had salvaged from a demolished building. You returned the favor weeks later with half a loaf of bread when her husband was laid up with injury and couldn't work. There's a shame that comes with not being able to afford enough coal to keep your family warm. You see it in the faces of the men who come home empty-handed, in the way mothers wrap their children in extra layers and pretend it's enough. The shame is worse than the cold sometimes, this feeling that you're failing at the most basic requirement of providing for your family. You see it reflected in the eyes of the coal dealer when he measures out your meager purchase, in the way the foreman at the factory looks at you when you shiver too obviously at your station. In the boarding houses where multiple families share a single space, there are unspoken rules about who gets to sit closest to the communal fire. The oldest, the sickest, the children, they get priority, usually, but not always. Arguments break out sometimes, brief and bitter, over who added coal last, who's been hogging the warmth, who deserves to be comfortable. But mostly people just endure in silence. You've heard stories of families in the boarding houses who mark their coal pieces with chalk so they can prove what belongs to them, who set schedules for fire access with the precision of factory shift work. The desperation that drives such measures is something you understand completely, even as it saddens you. Children learn quickly where to find warmth. They hover near bakery ovens when the doors open, linger outside the doors of pubs where heat spills out, press themselves against the warm brick walls of factory buildings. You've seen them clustered around the smithy's forge, drawn to it like moths to flame, until the smith shoos them away with a wave of his hammer. They scatter but return within minutes, unable to resist the pull of heat in a cold world. The psychological weight of the cold is heavier than the physical sensation. It's the knowledge that tomorrow will be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. It's the exhaustion of never being comfortable, never being able to relax, always bracing yourself against the next gust of wind or the next draft slipping under the door. Your body holds tension in ways you don't even notice anymore. Shoulders tight, jaw clenched, muscles always just a little bit rigid. This constant tension exhausts you more than the physical labor of the factory sometimes. You catch yourself grinding your teeth at night, clenching your fists even in sleep, your body unable to release its vigilance against the cold, even when your mind has surrendered to unconsciousness. But there are small comforts too, moments that cut through the monotony of suffering. The feeling of your hands finally warming over a fading flame, fingers tingling as sensation returns, is something close to joy. The pain that comes with warming is intense, a burning ache that makes your eyes water, but you welcome it because it means your hands are still yours, still capable of feeling. You've seen old workers whose fingers stay white and numb, even near the fire, and you know what that means. Frostbite has claimed them permanently. The smell of stew heating by the fire, thin and watery though it may be, fills the room with a warmth that's more than physical. It's the promise of something warm inside you, something that will chase the cold from your belly for a little while. The steam rises from the pot, carrying with it scents of turnip and onion, maybe a bit of mutton if the week has been good. You breathe it in deeply, letting the warm vapor fill your lungs, and for a moment the cold recedes just slightly. At night, when the fire has died and the room is dark and cold, there's a strange comfort in human closeness. Bodies pressed together under shared blankets, warmth borrowed and shared in equal measure. You listen to the rain on the roof, the wind rattling the window, the soft breathing of the people beside you. The house never feels truly warm, but in these moments it feels a little less cold. The rhythm of another person's breathing becomes a kind of music, a reminder that you're not alone in this struggle. When the children whimper in their sleep, disturbed by cold dreams, you pull them closer, lending them what little warmth your body has to offer. Sleep comes slowly, a gradual surrender to exhaustion. You drift off with the cold still pressing in, your body finally too tired to notice. And then, before it seems possible, the morning comes again. The cold is waiting, patient and inevitable, and the ritual begins anew. The moment of waking is always disorienting, a confused second where you can't quite remember where you are or what season holds you in its grip. Then the cold registers, sharp and immediate, and memory returns with disappointing clarity. Your life is shaped by the cold in ways you don't always think about. The routes you walk are chosen for their shelter from the wind. You know every alley that blocks the north wind, every building that provides a windbreak, every corner where the sun might hit for a few precious minutes in the afternoon. Your mental map of the city is drawn not by landmarks but by degrees of exposure to the elements. The time you spend outdoors is calculated down to the minute, just long enough to do what needs doing, never a moment longer. Your friendships are forged in shared suffering, your conversations punctuated by shivers and the stamping of frozen feet. You speak in shorthand with your neighbors, communicating volumes with a glance or a gesture, because actual talking requires too much energy, exposes your mouth to too much cold air. A raised eyebrow asks, "How are you managing?" and a slight shrug answers the same as everyone else. You remember summers with a kind of distant wonder, as if warmth is something from another life. In the depths of winter, it's hard to imagine ever being too hot, ever wanting to shed a layer or open a window. Last July seems like a dream or a story Someone told you about a different world. You recall complaining about the heat, about the stuffiness of the factory on hot days, and the memory makes you almost laugh now. What you wouldn't give for that problem instead of this one. The seasons turn eventually, and spring arrives with a slowness that feels cruel. The cold doesn't leave all at once. It retreats gradually, grudgingly, loosening its grip finger by finger. But for now, in the heart of winter, in the year 1874, you are cold. You have been cold for so long that you can't remember what it feels like not to be. The cold has become a part of your identity, woven into who you are as surely as your name or your trade. When someone asks how you are, the answer is always understood: cold, tired, enduring. You'll wake tomorrow to the same frozen jug, the same damp clothes, the same reluctant fire. You'll walk the same frost-covered streets to the same factory, endure the same extremes of heat and cold, and come home to the same dark, frozen house. This is your life, and the lives of thousands like you, repeated endlessly across the narrow streets of industrial Britain. A quiet struggle, waged in silence, against an enemy that never sleeps and never yields. In the grander houses across town where merchants and factory owners live, there are coal-fired central heating systems, multiple fireplaces in every room, servants whose sole job is to maintain warmth. You've heard of such things but never seen them, and trying to imagine such luxury is like trying to imagine life on the moon. The cold is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning. It simply is, constant and patient, waiting in every corner, filling every space you leave undefended. And you, like everyone else, simply endure, because there is no other choice, and because tomorrow the sun will rise again, thin and pale through the haze, and there will be work to do. The factory whistle will blow, the foreman will call for production. The machines will roar to life regardless of how cold you are, how tired you feel, how much your bones ache from a night spent shivering under insufficient blankets. The fire will need lighting, the coal will need rationing, the children will need tending. Life will continue cold and difficult and unrelenting until one day, years from now, someone will invent a better way to heat a home. But that day is not today. Today you are cold and you will remain cold, and that is simply how things are. The acceptance of this reality is perhaps the hardest lesson winter teaches. Fighting against it, raging at the unfairness, wishing for change. These things only make the suffering worse by adding mental anguish to physical discomfort. The rhythm of your days is set by the cold: wake, shiver, light the fire, leave, work, return, shiver, light the fire again, sleep. Over and over, without variation, without relief. You grow accustomed to it in the way that people grow accustomed to anything that cannot be changed. The cold becomes background noise, ever present but no longer surprising. Your body adapts in small ways. You learn to sleep curled tight to conserve heat, to breathe shallowly so the cold air doesn't hurt your lungs as much, to move efficiently to minimize the time spent in the worst of the cold. These adaptations happen unconsciously, your body's desperate attempt to survive in conditions it was never meant to endure. But accustomed does not mean comfortable. You never stop noticing the cold, never stop feeling it in your bones, never stop dreaming of warmth. On the worst nights, when the wind howls and the fire won't catch and the damp seems to seep through the very walls, you wonder how much longer you can bear it. But the morning always comes and you always bear it, because what else is there to do? The human capacity for endurance is both inspiring and heartbreaking. You witness it in yourself and your neighbors every day, this ability to wake up and continue, to find the strength to light another fire, walk another frozen street, work another exhausting shift. The coal in the box grows lower. The winter stretches on, and you, wrapped in layers that are never quite enough, huddled near a fire that never burns quite hot enough, continue the quiet, endless struggle to simply stay warm. This is not a story of triumph or tragedy. It's a story of endurance, of ordinary people facing an ordinary hardship with nothing but patience and grim determination. History will remember this era for its industry, its innovation, its transformation of Britain into the workshop of the world. But it will often forget to mention the cost of that transformation, paid in cold nights and aching bones and lives, shortened by the very coal that supposedly brought progress. The coal does not care about your suffering. It does not listen to your complaints or respond to your prayers. It simply exists, indifferent and eternal, and you exist within it, small and fragile and cold. And perhaps that is the hardest part, not the physical discomfort, but the knowledge that your struggle matters to no one but yourself. The politicians in London debate trade policy and colonial expansion. The merchants count their profits from cotton and steel. The newspapers trumpet Britain's industrial might and growing empire. And you shiver in your two-room house, unknown and uncounted except as a unit of labour, a number in the factory's employment rolls. The world outside your window continues, indifferent to whether you are warm or cold, comfortable or suffering. The factories keep running, the streets keep filling, the coal dealers keep raising their prices. And you keep waking, keep working, keep enduring, because this is life in Victorian Britain. And for people like you, there is no other way. Your hands crack and bleed from the cold, the skin splitting across your knuckles despite the grease you rub on them. Each movement of your fingers opens the wounds anew, but you cannot afford to stop working, cannot afford to let such a small thing as bleeding hands slow your productivity. The foreman has no sympathy for cold-related ailments. He's seen it all before. Frostbitten fingers, skin blue-white with cold, workers who can barely hold their tools because their hands shake so badly from the chill. His job is to extract production from bodies, and bodies are plentiful in Manchester in 1874. If you cannot work, someone else will take your place before the day is done. The threat of replacement haunts every worker in the factory, unspoken but omnipresent. You've seen it happen, a man too sick or injured to perform his duties, sent home without pay, his spot filled within the hour by someone from the crowd of desperate people always waiting at the factory gates. So you work through the pain, through the cold, through the exhaustion that makes your vision blur and your thoughts turn slow and thick. You work because the alternative is starvation, eviction, the workhouse, fates worse than any amount of cold or discomfort. The workhouse looms large in the collective imagination of your neighbourhood, spoken of in hushed voices, feared more than disease or death. To end up there is to admit complete defeat, to accept the charity of the state and all the humiliation and suffering that comes with it. You've heard the stories from those who've been there. Families separated, men from women from children, work more brutal than any factory demands, food so meagre that people waste away to nothing. Better to endure the cold, better to struggle on your own terms than to surrender to that particular form of institutional cruelty. The wind tonight is particularly fierce, finding every crack in your walls, every gap in your window frame. The candle flame dances wildly despite being sheltered behind your hand, and you give up trying to read the week-old newspaper you salvaged from the factory office. Reading is a luxury anyway, requiring light and leisure you can rarely afford. Most nights pass in darkness after the fire dies, the only sound the wind outside and the soft movements of your family preparing for bed. You wonder sometimes what life must be like for those born into comfort, for whom warmth is simply assumed, a condition of existence, rather than a goal to be struggled toward. Do they even notice it, or is warmth like air to them, invisible and unremarkable until it's absent? The thought leads nowhere productive, so you let it fade. Envy serves no purpose when there's no possibility of change, no mechanism by which your circumstances might improve to match theirs. Social mobility is not entirely impossible. There are stories, rare and treasured, of workers who saved enough to open small shops or whose children learned trades that lifted them slightly higher. But these stories are exceptional enough to be noteworthy precisely because they're so uncommon. For most, your station in life is fixed at birth. The son of a factory worker becomes a factory worker, the daughter of a seamstress becomes a seamstress, and the grandchildren inherit the same narrow world their grandparents inhabited. The cold reminds you of this fixedness, this inability to transcend your circumstances. A wealthy man can simply buy more coal, install better windows, hire servants to maintain his fires. You cannot, and this fact is as immutable as winter itself. Tomorrow the coal delivery is scheduled, and you've been rationing extra carefully this week to ensure you can afford the full amount you've ordered. It meant letting the fire die earlier each night, adding an extra layer of suffering to evenings already difficult enough. But the calculation is simple. Suffer more now to avoid suffering even more later. Mathematics of survival, equations written in cold flesh and aching bones. The children have grown quieter as the winter has progressed, their usual energy suppressed by the constant cold and the thin meals that are all you can provide. You miss their laughter, their play, the way they used to chase each other around the room before winter settled in. Now they sit still, conserving energy, their eyes following you as you move about your evening tasks. They've learned, without being told, that movement generates heat, but also requires food, and food is scarce. You've begun to notice how thin they've grown, how their clothes hang loose on frames that should be filling out with growth. The cold suppresses appetite to some degree, but inadequate food suppresses growth, and you lie awake some nights calculating whether they'll reach spring without permanent damage. These thoughts are dangerous, leading down paths of worry and guilt that serve no purpose. You push them away and focus on immediate tasks, banking the fire for the night, checking that the door is sealed as well as it can be, laying out tomorrow's clothes so you won't have to fumble for them in the dark. The moon tonight is bright enough to cast shadows through your window, pale light painting the room in shades of grey. On clear nights like this, the cold is always worse. No cloud cover to trap what little heat the earth holds. You can see frost forming on the inside of your window, delicate patterns that would be beautiful if they didn't represent another way that heat escapes your home. By morning, the frost will be thick enough to scratch your fingernail through, crystallized moisture drawn from the air itself. The landlord, when you've mentioned the windows to him, merely shrugged. Repairs cost money, and why spend it when there are 10 families waiting to take your place if you choose to leave? He's not a cruel man particularly, just a practical one operating within the logic of a system where labor is abundant and housing is scarce. Your comfort matters less than your rent, and as long as the latter is paid, the former is your own concern. You've learned not to expect better, not to hope for improvements that will never come. The house is what it is, and you're grateful to have even this much shelter, inadequate though it may be. Outside you hear footsteps on the cobblestones, the night watchman making his rounds, or perhaps a late worker returning from a longer shift than yours. The sounds of the street continue through darkness, this city that never fully sleeps. Manchester at night is quieter than during the day, but never silent. Always there's the distant sound of machinery from the few factories that run around the clock, the occasional clatter of a cart, voices raised in argument, or song from the public houses that stay open late. You think about sleep, about surrendering to it despite the cold, about the few hours of oblivion before the dawn bell rings and the cycle begins again. Sleep is itself a kind of escape, a temporary respite from awareness of your circumstances. But tonight, sleep feels elusive, your body too cold to relax, your mind too active with worry about tomorrow's coal delivery, about whether you've calculated correctly, about whether you can afford what you need. The numbers run through your head again and again. Earnings minus rent, minus food, minus coal, minus the countless small expenses that drain away pennies with relentless efficiency. The equation never balances the way you need it to, always leaving you short, always requiring choices between bad options. Tomorrow you'll manage somehow the same way you've managed every day before this. You'll light the fire, walk to the factory, work your shift, come home, and repeat. The cold will press in from all sides, and you'll press back with whatever strength you can muster. This is what survival looks like in Victorian Britain's industrial heart, not dramatic or heroic, but quiet and grinding, a daily negotiation with hardship that never ends, only pauses long enough for sleep before beginning again with dawn. And so you finally close your eyes, pulling the thin blankets up to your chin, curling tight against the cold, breathing slowly and deliberately as you wait for sleep to claim you. Outside, the wind continues its assault on your walls, indifferent to your struggles, patient in its siege. Morning will come whether you're ready or not. The cold will still be there, waiting, and you will rise to meet it, as you always have, because in the end, what choice do you have but to continue, to endure, to survive one more day in the winter of 1874? As the streets of Manchester settle into another cold evening, let us drift elsewhere now across the Channel and further east to another world of winter and invention. In the sprawling, frost-locked empire of Russia, in the city of St. Petersburg, where the Neva River freezes solid and the wind cuts like broken glass, there lived a man whose name you have likely never heard. Franz San Galli was born in Prussia in 1824 in a region where winter was not merely a season, but a test of survival. His childhood was spent in rooms much like the ones we have just left behind, where warmth was scarce and cold was the constant companion of every waking hour. His family was neither wealthy nor destitute. They occupied that uncertain middle ground where comfort was possible but never guaranteed. The winters of his youth taught him that heat was precious, that warmth could not be taken for granted, and that the struggle against cold was universal. The house where Franz grew up stood at the edge of a small Prussian town, its windows rattling in their frames when the wind blew hard from the east. The family huddled together in the kitchen during the worst months, abandoning the outer rooms entirely to the creeping frost that painted elaborate patterns on the inside of the glass. His father was a minor official, a man who worked with papers and accounts, who left before dawn and returned after dark throughout the winter months. His mother managed the household with the same careful efficiency she applied to rationing coal, stretching every resource to cover the long months when warmth was more precious than food. Young Franz learned early that comfort was something you created, not something you simply received. He watched his mother stuff rags into gaps around doorframes, watched his father calculate exactly how much coal they could afford to burn each day. The mathematics of survival became second nature to him. How many logs equaled one bucket of coal, how long a fire could be banked before it died completely, how to position yourself in a room to catch the maximum benefit of minimal heat. These were the lessons that would later inform his life's work, though he did not know it then. His education was solid but unremarkable, the kind afforded to the sons of minor officials who showed aptitude but not brilliance. He learned mathematics and basic sciences, studied technical drawing and the principles of mechanics that were beginning to transform the industrial world. But his truest education came from observation, watching how smoke rose from chimneys, how heat pooled in corners, how metal contracted in the cold. He developed the habit of noticing things that others overlooked, the small inefficiencies and lost opportunities that surrounded daily life. As a young man, Franz turned his attention toward commerce and engineering, drawn to the practical problems of daily life. he moved to St. Petersburg in his 20s, a city that seemed designed to remind its inhabitants of their vulnerability to winter. The decision to leave Prussia was not born of ambition but of opportunity. A distant relative had connections in Russia, and the expanding empire needed men with technical skills. St. Petersburg in the 1840s was a city of extremes, where imperial palaces stood blocks away from workers' hovels, where European sophistication collided with Russian severity. Franz arrived in autumn when the city was at its most beautiful, the leaves turning gold along the Nevsky Prospect. By December, he understood what he had committed himself to: winters that made Prussia seem temperate, cold that penetrated stone and brick as if they were fabric. There he established himself as a merchant and a tinkerer, a man with a workshop full of metal tools, pipes and half-finished ideas. The workshop was small and dimly lit, heated by a single iron stove that did little to ward off the Siberian cold that pressed against the walls. The building he rented stood in a district where German merchants congregated, bringing their customs and languages to this Russian capital. His neighbors were watchmakers and instrument makers, brewers and bookbinders, each pursuing their trade in the methodical way that Germans had refined over centuries. Franz's workshop became his refuge and his laboratory, a space where commercial necessity met experimental curiosity. He imported machinery parts from Prussia, sold tools to Russian factories, and gradually built a modest reputation as someone who could solve mechanical problems. Franz spent his days observing the world around him with the careful attention of someone who believed problems could be solved. He watched how heat moved through buildings, how it rose and dissipated, how it gathered in some rooms and abandoned others entirely. The wealthy merchants' homes he visited revealed a pattern. No matter how many stoves they installed, certain rooms remained perpetually cold. Heat was elusive, resistant to being controlled or directed. It simply rose and vanished while the occupants shivered. He saw grand palaces where dozens of fireplaces burned constantly, yet corridors remained frozen. He saw humble homes where families huddled around a single stove, their backs cold while their faces burned. The Winter Palace itself, that monument to imperial power, was notorious among those who worked there for its impossible temperatures, ballrooms blazing with heat from enormous stoves, while servants' passages felt like ice caves. The Tsar could command armies, but could not command warmth to spread evenly through his own residence. This struck Franz as fundamentally wrong, not just inconvenient, but almost offensive in its wastefulness. Resources were being consumed, forests of wood, mountains of coal, yet the basic goal of keeping people warm was barely being achieved. The inefficiency of it troubled him, not in an abstract philosophical way, but in the immediate, practical way that troubles a man who has spent too many nights shivering in his own workshop. Heat, he reasoned, should not be a luxury, confined to the immediate vicinity of a flame. It should spread gently, evenly, filling entire rooms with steady warmth that required no constant tending, no endless feeding of fuel. This was his dream, quiet and humble, not glory or fame, but simply a world where people could be warm without struggle. The dream took shape slowly, without a single moment of revelation or inspiration. Franz was not a man given to dramatic insights or sudden visions. His mind worked methodically, building understanding piece by piece, like laying bricks. He began by reading everything he could find about heating systems, which was not much. The technical literature of the 1840s contained scattered references to hot water systems in greenhouses, experimental installations in factories, ambitious failures in wealthy homes. The technology of heating in the mid-19th century was primitive by later standards. Fireplaces and stoves dominated, both wildly inefficient, both requiring constant attention. Fireplaces sent most of their heat straight up the chimney, warming only those who sat directly in front of them. Stoves were better, but they created harsh, uneven heat, scorching nearby while leaving the rest of the room untouched. Some wealthy homes employed elaborate systems of hot air ducts, where a massive furnace in the basement heated air that rose through channels in the walls. These systems were expensive, difficult to control, and prone to spreading smoke and fumes along with the heat. The idea of using water as a heat-carrying medium had been discussed since the late 18th century, but practical implementation had defeated most who attempted it. Water was both promising and treacherous. It held heat well, but froze destructively, flowed smoothly but corroded metal, expanded when heated but could not be compressed. Franz began experimenting with water as a medium for heat distribution. The idea was not entirely new, others had attempted similar systems, but the execution was fraught with challenges that defeated most who tried. Hot water had the advantage of holding heat longer than air, of moving through pipes to distant rooms, of radiating warmth gently rather than blasting it harshly. But the technical obstacles were formidable. Pipes leaked, water froze, metal warped under temperature changes, and the whole system required careful calibration to function properly. The first question was one of materials. What kind of pipe could withstand both the corrosive properties of water and the thermal expansion that came with heating? Cast iron was strong but brittle, prone to cracking under temperature stress. Copper was more flexible but expensive, and its joints were difficult to seal permanently. Lead was soft enough to form easily, but toxic and structurally weak over time. Franz's early attempts were failures, as all first attempts must be. Pipes burst in the night, flooding his workshop with scalding water. The first catastrophic failure came in January of 1847, when a hastily assembled system ruptured at 3 in the morning. Franz woke to find his workshop ankle-deep in steaming water, his carefully organized tools floating in the flood, years of notes dissolving into illegible pulp. He spent the next week salvaging what he could, drying metal parts, recopying ruined calculations from memory. The financial loss was significant enough to threaten his entire commercial operation, but what stung more was the proof of how far he remained from a working solution. Joints failed under pressure, sending steam hissing through gaps he hadn't anticipated. Metal panels he fashioned to radiate heat developed cold spots, defeating the entire purpose of the design. Each failure revealed new problems he hadn't considered. Water circulated unevenly, creating hot and cold zones within the same system. Air trapped in pipes caused blockages that stopped circulation entirely. The rate of heat transfer through different metals varied wildly, making it difficult to predict how much surface area would be needed. Temperature differences between the boiler and the radiators needed to be carefully controlled, but he lacked precise thermometers and pressure gauges. But Franz was patient in the way that only a truly stubborn man can be patient. Each failure taught him something: which metals expanded too much, which joint designs held under pressure, how water circulated through pipes of different diameters. His notebooks filled with sketches and calculations, diagrams of pipe layouts, notes on optimal water temperatures. The work consumed him, not with fiery passion, but with steady, methodical determination. He developed the habit of rising before dawn to check his experimental systems, recording temperatures at hourly intervals throughout the day. His hands developed an almost unconscious ability to gauge temperature by touch, knowing instantly whether water was too hot or too cool for optimal circulation. Friends from the German merchant community worried about his obsession, suggesting gently that perhaps he should focus more on his commercial activities and less on expensive experiments. But Franz had discovered something about himself. He was constitutionally incapable of abandoning a problem once engaged with it. Years passed in this way, quietly, unmarked by drama or sudden breakthroughs. Franz worked through the long St. Petersburg winters, testing and refining, building and rebuilding. His workshop smelled of metal shavings and lamp oil, of coal smoke and the sharp tang of solder. His hands grew rough with work, scarred by hot metal and sharp edges. The 1850s passed in a blur of incremental progress and persistent setbacks. He refined his pipe joint designs dozens of times, testing each variation under pressure until he found connections that held reliably. He experimented with different boiler designs, seeking the optimal balance between heat output and fuel consumption. The boiler was the heart of the system, and getting it right proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the entire project. The emotional texture of those years was not one of excitement, but of patient endurance, the same quality that allowed Victorian labourers to face each frozen morning. Franz was warm only when bent over his work, and cold again the moment he stopped. His personal life became secondary to the work, a background hum of minimal social interaction and basic maintenance of existence. He never married, never established the kind of household that merchants of his standing were expected to maintain. There was no time for courtship, no energy for social obligations. The workshop claimed all of his attention, all of his resources, all of the creative capacity that some men might have devoted to family or fortune. Loneliness visited him on long winter evenings, but he had learned to endure it the way he endured cold, as a fact of existence, neither good nor bad, simply present. The work itself provided a kind of companionship, the problems presenting themselves with the reliability of old friends. Eventually, through sheer persistence, his designs began to work. The radiators he built were simple cast-iron panels with internal chambers through which hot water flowed. The breakthrough came not as a single moment, but as a gradual realization that his latest design had been running for weeks without failure. The system maintained consistent temperatures, circulated water reliably, and radiated heat exactly as he had envisioned. They radiated heat gently and steadily, warming the air around them without the harsh intensity of a stove or the wasteful directness of a fireplace. A boiler in the basement heated water, which then circulated through pipes to radiators in various rooms, creating even, consistent warmth throughout an entire building. The elegance of the final design lay in its simplicity. Water, heated in one location, circulated by natural convection, radiated its heat gradually as it passed through the system, then returned to be reheated. No pumps were required, no complicated mechanical systems, just the natural tendency of hot water to rise and cool water to fall. It was elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its implications. But revolutions are rarely recognized in their moment, especially quiet revolutions born in cold workshops. Franz understood what he had achieved, but he also understood that technical success was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in convincing others that his system was superior to the familiar discomforts they had always known. Franz began installing his systems in a few buildings around St. Petersburg, mostly for wealthy clients who could afford the initial expense. The results were impressive: rooms that stayed warm without constant tending, buildings that held heat evenly from cellar to attic. His first major installation was in the home of a German banker, a 3-story residence that had previously required 8 stoves and constant attention from servants. The transformation was dramatic. Servants who had spent their days hauling coal and tending fires were freed for other work. Temperatures remained stable throughout the day and night, and the banker's family experienced for the first time what it meant to be uniformly comfortable in their own home. Word spread through the wealthy merchant community, and Franz found himself with more commissions than he could handle. He hired assistants, trained them in the careful work of pipe fitting and system calibration, and gradually built a small business around his invention. Each installation taught him something new about scaling the system to different building sizes and configurations. Larger buildings required more sophisticated pipe networks, multiple zones that could be controlled independently, and boilers powerful enough to heat hundreds of gallons of water. Yet the systems were expensive, far beyond the reach of ordinary people. The cost of pipes, radiators, boilers, An installation meant that only palaces, grand hotels, and the homes of the very rich could afford such luxury. A typical installation might cost what a skilled worker earned in 5 years, an impossible sum for the vast majority of St. Petersburg's population. Franz calculated the costs obsessively, looking for ways to reduce expenses without compromising reliability, but the fundamental economics remained unchanged. Franz understood this limitation, and it troubled him. He had hoped to bring warmth to everyone, but economics dictated otherwise. The contradiction gnawed at him. He had solved the technical problem, but could not overcome the social and economic barriers that kept his solution from those who needed it most. His invention served the wealthy while the poor continued to shiver, exactly the pattern that characterized so much of 19th century progress. The people who needed his invention most, those shivering in Manchester row houses, those waking to frozen water jugs in London tenements, would never benefit from his work. This was the quiet tragedy of innovation in an unequal world. Solutions existed, but access did not. He tried various schemes to reduce costs, experimenting with cheaper materials and simpler designs. But every cost-cutting measure introduced new problems: inferior pipes that failed prematurely, simplified boilers that were difficult to control, reduced heat output that left rooms uncomfortably cool. Quality could not be compromised without defeating the purpose of the system. Franz accepted this with resignation, understanding that he had done what he could do within the constraints of his time and place. Word of Franz's radiators spread slowly through the networks of European engineers and architects. Some praised his work, others dismissed it as unnecessary or too complicated. Technical journals in Germany and France published descriptions of his systems, usually crediting him but sometimes attributing the invention to various other engineers who had worked on similar problems. Franz did not fight for recognition, understanding that ideas had a way of becoming collective property once released into the world. In Britain, where coal was cheap and tradition ran deep, many viewed radiator systems with suspicion. Fireplaces were what people knew, what they trusted, what their parents and grandparents had used. British engineers wrote skeptical articles questioning whether such systems could function reliably in climates less severe than Russia's. Some suggested that the British Constitution was better suited to the dry heat of fires than the humid warmth of radiators, a theory that Franz found both amusing and frustrating. The idea of hidden pipes carrying hot water through walls seemed unnatural, even dangerous. What if the pipes burst? What if the water froze? What if the system failed in the middle of winter and left you worse off than before? These were not unreasonable concerns, and Franz took them seriously. He had experienced pipe bursts himself and knew the damage they could cause, but he also knew that his refined designs included multiple safeguards: pressure relief valves, expansion tanks, drain cocks for winterization, and materials proven to withstand thermal stress. The systems required proper installation and basic maintenance, but they were not the dangerous contraptions that skeptics imagined. Franz encountered these objections again and again in letters from skeptical engineers, in conversations with potential investors. He answered them patiently, explaining the safeguards he had built in, the redundancies that prevented catastrophic failure. His correspondence from the 1860s reveals a man increasingly weary of making the same arguments repeatedly, yet never losing his fundamental courtesy or his willingness to explain. He sent detailed technical drawings to anyone who asked, shared his calculations freely, and offered advice to engineers attempting their own implementations. But convincing people to abandon familiar misery for unfamiliar comfort is one of the hardest tasks in the world. Change comes slowly, especially when it requires trust in things unseen. The psychological barrier was perhaps higher than the technical one. People could understand the physics of hot water circulation, but they could not easily overcome their instinctive distrust of new systems. Better to suffer in familiar ways than risk suffering in new ones. In the 1850s and 1860s, a few British buildings began experimenting with radiator systems, mostly in wealthy industrial cities like Glasgow and Manchester. These early installations were cautious, conservative, a few radiators in key rooms, not whole building systems. Engineers tinkered with Franz's designs, adapting them to British conditions, British pipes, British coal. Some improvements were made, some mistakes repeated. One successful installation in a Manchester textile mill demonstrated that central heating could reduce moisture problems that plagued the industry. The stable temperatures improved working conditions and reduced product defects, making a business case that appealed to practical-minded industrialists. Gradually, the technology gained a foothold, not through revolutionary enthusiasm, but through the slow accumulation of successful examples. Each working system made the next installation slightly less risky, slightly more acceptable. The technology advanced incrementally, quietly, without fanfare. Franz himself remained largely unknown to the British public, his name appearing only in technical journals and patent applications that few people ever read. He received some recognition within engineering circles, awards, honors, respectful acknowledgement of his contributions. But these meant little to the families still shivering in cold homes, still lighting fires with damp kindling, still rationing coal through long winters. The gap between innovation and implementation is often measured in generations. Franz San Galli's radiators planted seeds that would not fully bloom until the 20th century, when mass production and economic changes finally made central heating accessible to ordinary people. By then, Franz would be forgotten, his name lost in the collective amnesia that swallows all but the most famous innovators. He was not a Watt or an Edison, not a household name or a figure of legend. The injustice of this obscurity is worth considering. Men whose inventions touched millions of lives, whose work fundamentally altered human comfort and possibility, vanishing from historical memory, while others with better publicists or more dramatic personalities claimed all the attention. Franz seemed aware of this likelihood and accepted it with philosophical calm. He was simply a man who tried to solve a problem, who spent cold years in a dim workshop pursuing a quiet dream of warmth. His later years were spent in comfortable obscurity, still working, still refining his designs, still hoping that eventually his systems would reach those who needed them most. He corresponded with engineers across Europe, sharing knowledge freely, answering questions from strangers, offering advice to those attempting similar work. There was no bitterness in him, no resentment that others were building on his foundation without always acknowledging his contribution. A young engineer in Vienna wrote to him in 1885, describing improvements he had made to radiator valve design and asking for Franz's opinion. Franz replied with detailed comments and encouragement, pleased that the work was continuing, that each generation of engineers was building on what had come before. He understood perhaps that innovation is always collaborative, always built on the work of countless hands. His role was to move the work forward, to solve problems so others could solve the next set of problems, and eventually, perhaps, ordinary people would wake to warm homes. This perspective gave him a kind of peace that fame or fortune could never have provided. He had done his part, contributed what he could contribute, and the rest would unfold according to its own logic. Franz San Galli died in 1897 at the age of 73, in a world that had not yet fully embraced his vision. Central heating remained a luxury, fireplaces and stoves still dominated most homes, and millions of people still faced winter with nothing but coal and endurance. His death was noted in a few engineering journals, brief obituaries that summarized his contributions without fully appreciating their significance. He left behind no family, no fortune, just notebooks full of calculations and a handful of people who remembered him as a kind man who had devoted his life to solving a problem most people didn't realize could be solved. But the seeds were planted. The technology existed, proven and refined, waiting for the economic and social conditions that would allow it to spread. The essential work had been done, the technical challenges solved, the designs proven, the knowledge recorded and shared. What remained was for the world to catch up, for manufacturing to scale up, for wages to rise enough that ordinary people could afford what had once been luxuries. In the decades after his death, those conditions slowly materialized. Mass production lowered costs, labor movements improved wages, and gradually the warmth Franz had dreamed of reached more and more homes. The 20th century brought industrial capacity that could produce radiators by the thousands, pipes by the mile, boilers efficiently and affordably. What had required skilled craftsmen and custom fabrication became routine manufacturing, driving costs down to where middle-class families could afford central heating. By the 1920s and 1930s, new construction in European and American cities increasingly included central heating as standard. The technology Franz had pioneered became ordinary, expected, the baseline for modern domestic life. Today we live in that warm world he imagined, a world where heating systems hum quietly in basements, where warmth spreads evenly through every room, where winter is an inconvenience rather than a threat. We take it for granted, as we take for granted all the quiet victories of forgotten innovators. Franz San Galli's legacy is not in monuments or textbooks, but in the simple, unremarkable comfort of a warm home on a cold night. It's the kind of legacy that asks for no recognition, that functions best when invisible, when so thoroughly integrated into daily life that we forget it was ever invented at all. And perhaps that's the most fitting memorial for a man who wanted not fame, but simply to solve a problem, to look at human suffering and say, quietly, patiently, there must be a better way. He found that way, even if the world took decades to follow. As we drift away from Franz's story, we carry with us the understanding that every comfort we enjoy was once someone's obsession, someone's patient work in a cold workshop. The warmth in our homes traveled through time as much as through pipes, from Franz's hands to ours, across generations, quietly revolutionizing the way we live. The laborer in Manchester waking to frozen mornings in 1874 could not have known that a man in St. Petersburg was working toward their eventual comfort. The distance between them was not just geographical, but temporal. The gap between suffering and solution measured in decades. But the connection exists nonetheless, invisible threads linking the cold rooms of the past to the warm rooms of the present. Franz San Galli was one hand that wove those threads patiently, persistently, without recognition or reward beyond the satisfaction of work well done. His life reminds us that progress is not always dramatic, not always the result of sudden genius or spectacular breakthroughs. Sometimes it's just a man in a workshop, year after year, solving one small problem at a time. Sometimes it's the quiet accumulation of knowledge, the patient refinement of ideas, the willingness to fail and try again until something finally works. This is the unglamorous reality of innovation: cold hands, failed experiments, skeptical audiences, and the deep, sustaining belief that the problem is worth solving. Franz believed that belief carried him through decades of work, through failures and setbacks, through the knowledge that he might never see his dream fully realized. And in the end, he was right to believe. The world did become warmer, not all at once, not in his lifetime, but eventually, inevitably, because he and others like him refused to accept that suffering was simply the price of winter. They imagined warmth, and then they built it, one pipe at a time. Let us drift now into a quieter mystery, one that lives not in grand workshops or frozen tenements, but in the palm of your hand. In archaeological digs across Victorian Britain, buried beneath layers of ash and earth, small carved stones emerge, smooth, dense, roughly the size of a closed fist. Some are soapstone, soft and pale, worn smooth by handling. Others are ceramic, fired clay with a glaze that has cracked and crazed with age. Historians believe these were warming stones, objects heated near the fire and carried close to the body for temporary warmth. But the details of their use, the rituals surrounding them, the meanings they carried, these have been largely lost to time. This is the nature of ordinary objects, the curse of things too common to warrant documentation. Everyone knew what a warming stone was, how to use one, why it mattered, and so no one thought to write it down. We are left with the objects themselves, silent witnesses to practices we can only reconstruct through careful inference and imagination. Let us drift through this mystery together, holding these stones in our minds, feeling their weight, their smoothness, their lingering warmth. The stones vary in size, though most fit comfortably in an adult's hand. Some are oval, others more rectangular, a few perfectly round as if turned on a lathe. The weight is important, too light, and they wouldn't hold heat, too heavy, and they'd be impractical to carry. Soapstone was prized for its heat retention, its ability to absorb warmth from the fire and release it slowly over hours. Ceramic stones were cheaper, more common, found in humbler homes. They didn't hold heat as long, but were easier to produce, more accessible to families who couldn't afford better. The basic principle seems clear enough. Place the stone near the fire, let it absorb heat until it's almost too hot to touch, then wrap it in cloth and tuck it into your pocket or under your blankets. The stone becomes a portable source of warmth, a small defense against the cold that follows you wherever you go. But how exactly were they used? This is where certainty fades into educated guessing, where archaeology meets speculation. Some stones show wear patterns suggesting they were carried in pockets, rubbed smooth on one side by constant friction against fabric. These were likely the ones taken on long walks to work, to market, clutched in cold hands during the journey through frozen streets. Others show no such wear, suggesting they stayed mostly stationary, slipped under blankets at night perhaps, or placed against aching joints. The heat would have been gentle, not enough to burn, but enough to create a small zone of comfort in an otherwise frigid bed. The distribution of these stones across Britain tells its own story, one of regional variation and local adaptation. In northern England, particularly Yorkshire and Lancashire, the stones tend to be larger and cruder, often simple river rocks that required no carving. These regions were poor, industrial, places where people made do with whatever materials were at hand. The stones from these areas bear the marks of hard use, chips and cracks, surfaces worn almost glassy from years of handling. In Scotland, particularly the Highlands, the stones are often more carefully crafted, sometimes decorated with simple etchings, initials, dates, symbols whose meanings we can only guess at. Was this personalization practical, a way to identify your stone, among others warming by a communal fire? Or was it something more, an expression of ownership, of care, of the emotional significance these objects held? We don't know, and the stones themselves offer no answers. Urban stones differ from rural ones in subtle ways that suggest different uses. In cities like London and Manchester, where people lived in close quarters and moved frequently, the stones tend to be smaller, more portable, easier to carry and store. In rural areas where homes were more permanent and space less constrained, larger stones were common. Some rural households seem to have had multiple stones of different sizes, suggesting a more elaborate system of use, large ones for beds, smaller ones for pockets, perhaps specific stones for specific family members. The archaeological context in which these stones are found adds another layer to the mystery. They appear in working-class tenements and middle-class townhouses alike, suggesting that the need for portable warmth crossed economic boundaries. Yet the quality of the stones varies dramatically. Wealthy households owned smooth, professionally carved soapstone warmers, sometimes with brass or copper fittings, while poorer families made do with rough ceramic or unworked river rocks. The function remained constant, but the execution revealed one's place in the social hierarchy. One particularly puzzling finding is the discovery of warming stones in homes that show almost no other heating artifacts, no coal residue, no ash layers, minimal evidence of sustained fires. How were these stones heated? Were they brought from elsewhere, borrowed from neighbors, heated at communal ovens or forges? Or were the fires so carefully managed, the ash so thoroughly cleared, that they left no archaeological trace? The stones sit in museum storage, silent and enigmatic, refusing to reveal their secrets. Some scholars have suggested that certain households maintained what might be called warming stations, designated areas where stones could be heated without requiring a full domestic fire. These might have been small braziers or dedicated heating boxes, devices that consumed minimal fuel while keeping several stones hot throughout the day. Evidence for such devices is scarce, but the logic is compelling. In homes where fuel was expensive and carefully rationed, a small, continuous heat source for warming stones would have been more economical than repeatedly building up a fire. The texture of these stones is worth imagining. Soapstone, when new, has a waxy smoothness that feels almost alive under your fingers. It's soft enough to carve with simple tools, which is why so many show decorative elements, names, dates, crude patterns. As it ages and is handled, it develops a patina, a deep, lustrous quality that comes from years of being touched, carried, cherished. Ceramic stones feel different, harder, more brittle, with a slight roughness even when glazed. They lack the organic warmth of soapstone, but they're more durable, less likely to crack if dropped. The weight of a warming stone in your hand would have been reassuring, substantial. In a world where so much was uncertain and uncomfortable, here was something solid, dependable, a tangible source of comfort you could control. There's a particular intimacy to objects that are held, that spend time pressed against the body. A warming stone was not furniture or decoration, not something you looked at from across the room. It was something you grasped, felt, kept close to your skin through layers of clothing. This physical proximity meant the stone became familiar in ways other household objects never could. You knew its exact weight, its precise contours, the way it fit your palm. Beyond their practical function, warming stones seem to have carried emotional and cultural significance that we're only beginning to understand. Warmth in Victorian Britain was more than physical comfort. It was a form of care, a gesture of affection, a symbol of home. To warm a stone and give it to someone was to give them part of yourself, to transfer your labor and attention into an object that would comfort them in your absence. Mothers warmed stones for children heading out into the cold, wives for husbands working long hours, children for elderly parents whose circulation had grown weak. The act of preparation, selecting the right stone, heating it to just the right temperature, wrapping it carefully in cloth, was itself a ritual of care. Too hot and it could burn through the wrapping, too cool and it would offer no comfort. Getting it right required attention, experience, the kind of knowledge that passes between generations without being spoken. A properly warmed stone, correctly wrapped, could provide gentle heat for hours, a constant reminder of the person who prepared it. The wrapping materials themselves deserve consideration, though few have survived to enter the archaeological record. Wool was ideal, thick enough to prevent burns while allowing heat to radiate through gradually. Old clothing, worn too thin for wearing but still serviceable as wrapping, would have been common. Some households might have kept dedicated cloths for this purpose, squares of flannel or burlap that showed the scorch marks and oil stains of repeated use. Some stones bear inscriptions that suggest they were gifts, tokens of affection exchanged between people. To Mary, with love, scratched into soapstone, dated 1867. Remember me, carved into ceramic, the letters crude but earnest. These weren't expensive gifts. Warming stones cost almost nothing, but they were deeply personal, objects made meaningful through use and intention. To receive a decorated warming stone was to receive something that had been touched, shaped, prepared by hands that cared for you. It was warmth made tangible, affection made practical. The craftsmanship visible in some of these inscriptions suggests they were significant undertakings. Carving into soapstone requires time and steady hands, and the results were permanent. To inscribe a name or message was to declare that this object, this source of comfort, belonged to a specific person and carried specific meanings. In households where possessions were few and closely guarded, such personalization elevated a simple stone into something approaching treasure. The stones also appear in curious contexts that suggest other uses, perhaps ritual or symbolic. Several have been found buried with the dead, tucked into coffins alongside other personal items. Were these simply beloved possessions, or did they carry some symbolic meaning related to warmth in the afterlife? Victorian spiritualism and folk beliefs were rich with metaphors of cold death and warm life. Could these stones have represented a wish for comfort beyond the grave? We can only speculate, but the fact that people chose to bury these objects suggests they meant more than simple tools. They were imbued with memory, with the warmth of living hands, with the care of those left behind. The Victorian preoccupation with death and mourning extended to the smallest objects. Hair jewelry, memorial cards, photographs of the deceased, all served to maintain connection with those who had passed. A warming stone, especially one used daily by the departed, would have carried powerful associations. It had touched their skin, absorbed their body heat, been warmed by their hands countless times. Some stones show evidence of being kept long after they could no longer hold heat effectively. Cracked stones that would have cooled too quickly, broken pieces held together with wire or glue. Why keep a broken warming stone? Perhaps for the same reason we keep any broken thing that once gave comfort, because throwing it away feels like throwing away the memory of warmth itself. These patched stones speak to the deep human reluctance to let go of objects that have comforted us, even when their practical utility has ended. The repairs themselves are fascinating, tiny monuments to the desire to preserve. Wire wound tightly around a crack, showing where someone spent careful minutes binding the pieces together. Glue or pitch applied with precision, attempting to seal a break just well enough that the stone might hold heat one more winter. These were not professional repairs, but domestic ones, done with whatever materials were at hand, motivated by attachment rather than economy. In a few rare cases, stones have been found with small cavities drilled into them, sometimes filled with lavender, herbs, or other fragrant materials. These scented warmers seem to have served a dual purpose: heat and aromatherapy, comfort for both body and mind. The combination of gentle warmth and calming scent would have created a multisensory experience of comfort, a small luxury in lives otherwise defined by hardship. Who had the time and resources to create such things? Were they made by the users themselves during rare moments of leisure, or were they gifts from someone with more means? The stones don't answer, but they invite us to imagine scenes of quiet preparation, of care being lavished on small things because large comforts were impossible. The herbs used varied by region and availability. Lavender was common where it grew well, valued for its calming properties and pleasant scent. Rosemary appears in some stones, perhaps chosen for its association with remembrance and fidelity. Some contain dried roses or violets, flowers that would have been carefully preserved from summer gardens to provide comfort through winter months. There's also the question of communal use. In boarding houses and shared dwellings, did warming stones pass between strangers, or did each person guard their own jealously? Were there social hierarchies around warmth, unspoken rules about who deserved comfort and who didn't? The archaeological record suggests that in some shared spaces, warming stones were more common than in private homes, perhaps because residents couldn't monopolize the communal fire but could claim a stone to carry away. This would have created a daily ritual, the evening gathering around the fire, each person waiting their turn to heat their stone, small negotiations over who got to place their stone closest to the coals. These mundane social interactions, repeated nightly through long winters, shaped relationships and hierarchies in ways we can only glimpse through the objects left behind. Imagine the dynamics in a boarding house parlor as dusk falls and the temperature drops. Workers returning from factories and shops, servants finishing their duties, all converging on the single source of heat. The fire would be carefully tended, coal or wood added sparingly to keep it burning without waste. Around it, people would arrange their stones, each in their designated spot, according to some unspoken agreement negotiated through seasons of cohabitation. The mystery deepens when we consider regional variations in stone design that don't seem to correlate with practical needs. In certain areas of Wales, stones are consistently decorated with spiral patterns, while in Cornwall, crosses are common. Were these purely decorative choices, or did they carry specific cultural meanings? Did certain symbols denote ownership by particular families or guilds? Did they serve as identifiers in communities where literacy was low and names written in stone meant nothing? Or were they simply aesthetic preferences, people making beautiful the things they touched every day? The spiral patterns found on Welsh stones are particularly intriguing, echoing ancient Celtic motifs that persisted in folk art long after their original meanings had been forgotten. Were people consciously reaching back to older traditions, or had these designs simply become part of the regional visual vocabulary, reproduced without understanding their historical significance? The crosses on Cornish stones might suggest religious devotion, a blessing carved into an everyday object. Or they might have been simpler markers, the easiest recognizable symbol for people with limited carving skills. Without written records, we're left to wander through possibilities, each as plausible as the last. The stones sit in museum drawers and display cases arranged by region and period, labeled with cautious language: possible warming stone, alleged bed warmer, function uncertain. Archaeologists handle them carefully, measuring dimensions, analyzing wear patterns, comparing one specimen to another, trying to coax stories from silent objects. But the stones keep their secrets, offering only fragments of the fuller picture. Modern analysis techniques have revealed some details the original users never knew. Microscopic examination shows residue from the cloths that wrapped them, wool fibers, cotton threads, sometimes silk from wealthier households. Chemical analysis of staining patterns suggests what fuels were used to heat them: coal, wood, peat, each leaving its distinctive signature. Yet these scientific insights, valuable as they are, can't tell us what it felt like to hold one, what comfort it brought, what memories it carried. What we do know with certainty is that these objects mattered to people. They were made with care, used extensively, sometimes decorated or personalized, occasionally buried with the dead. They represent one small strategy in humanity's long struggle against cold, a struggle that Franz San Galli tried to solve with radiators, that the Manchester labourer faced with coal and endurance. Warming stones were humbler than radiators, more personal than fireplaces, intimate objects that bridged the gap between individual body and hostile environment. The evolution of warming stones parallels broader technological changes in Victorian society. Early in the period, most were rough, functional objects with little decoration. As manufacturing techniques improved and mass production became common, even humble household items began to show more refinement. By the 1880s, factories were producing standardized ceramic warmers with molded designs, sold through catalogs and general stores. Imagine holding one now in your mind. Feel its weight, its smoothness, the faint residual warmth it might still hold if you'd just pulled it from the fire. Imagine wrapping it in a scrap of wool, tucking it into your coat pocket, feeling it press against your ribs as you walk through frozen streets. The warmth seeps through the fabric, spreading across your chest, a small sun that belongs only to you. Hours later, when you reach your destination, the stone is merely warm, then tepid, then cool. But for those first precious hours, it was comfort incarnate. Someone who loved you heated that stone, wrapped it carefully, made sure you had it before you left. That's the warmth that lingers longest, isn't it? Not the physical heat which fades inevitably, but the warmth of being cared for, of mattering enough that someone took the time. The physical sensation would have been distinctive, different from the radiating heat of a fire or the enveloping warmth of blankets. A warming stone provided localized heat, concentrated in one spot against your body. Press it against your stomach and feel the warmth spread through your core. Hold it against cold hands and watch your fingers slowly regain feeling, blood flow returning with that peculiar tingle of warming flesh. Perhaps that's what these stones really were, not just heating devices, but tokens of connection, physical manifestations of care in a world where survival required constant effort and comfort was always scarce. To warm a stone for someone was to say, in the language of action, rather than words, I want you to be less cold. In Victorian Britain, where emotional expression was often constrained by social convention, where affection might be difficult to voice directly, a warming stone could speak volumes. It was practical and symbolic at once, serving immediate needs while carrying deeper meanings. The stones in museums, stripped of context and use, can only hint at these layers of significance. But if we sit with them quietly, if we let our imagination drift through the lives that touched them, patterns begin to emerge. We see mothers and children, masters and servants, neighbors and strangers, all connected by the simple need for warmth and the small kindnesses that met that need. The stones were nodes in networks of care, passed hand to hand, heated and reheated, worn smooth by countless touches. Consider the life cycle of a single stone, from creation or selection through years of use to eventual abandonment. Someone chose it, perhaps at a market, perhaps from a riverbed, perhaps commissioned from a craftsman. It entered a household, was assigned a place near the hearth, became part of the daily routine. Winter after winter, it absorbed heat and released it, becoming familiar, essential, unremarkable in its constancy. And then gradually they disappeared. By the early 20th century, warming stones had largely vanished from daily use, replaced by more efficient technologies, hot water bottles, electric blankets, eventually central heating. The knowledge of how to use them properly, how to heat them without cracking them, how to wrap them safely, all of this faded from living memory. The stones themselves were discarded, forgotten, buried in trash heaps and construction fill, where archaeologists would later find them and puzzle over their purpose. This is how ordinary objects become mysteries. They exist in such abundance and familiarity that no one thinks to document them, and then the world changes, the practices end, and suddenly no one remembers, no one. The transition away from warming stones wasn't sudden or uniform. In some rural areas, they persisted well into the 1920s and beyond, kept by elderly people who had always used them and saw no reason to change. Children born in the early 20th century might remember grandparents with odd stone objects kept by the fire, relics from an earlier time that seemed quaint but incomprehensible. Why would anyone carry a rock in their pocket when rubber hot water bottles were available? We're left with fragments, the objects themselves, occasional mentions in letters or diaries, wear patterns and design variations that hint at use but don't explain it fully. The rest is silence, the vast, unrecorded life of ordinary people doing ordinary things to survive ordinary hardships. But in that silence, there's also space for imagination, for us to drift through possibilities and construct our own understandings. The warming stones invite us to consider what comfort meant to people whose lives were harder than ours, who faced daily struggles we can barely imagine. They remind us that warmth, physical, emotional, social, has always been something people had to create, to maintain, to share. It doesn't simply exist, it must be made over and over through effort and intention. The stones are artifacts of that effort, small, smooth objects that fit in a hand, that held heat for hours, that carried meanings we're still trying to decode. They're mysteries, yes, but gentle ones, the kind that don't demand solutions so much as invite contemplation. There's something profoundly moving about objects that served such humble purposes yet were cherished enough to be personalized, repaired, even buried with the dead. They speak to the human capacity to find significance in small things, to invest everyday objects with meaning through repeated use and careful attention. In our own era of abundant central heating and instant comfort, it's difficult to fully grasp what these stones represented. We adjust thermostats with a touch, never thinking about the fuel consumed or the mechanisms that deliver warmth throughout our homes. The Victorian user of a warming stone understood warmth as something precious and finite, something that required forethought and effort. You couldn't simply have warmth whenever you wanted it. You had to plan for it, prepare for it, carry it with you in physical form. And so we leave them there, in their ambiguity, scattered across museum collections and archaeological reports, still holding their secrets, still waiting for someone to fully understand the warmth they once provided. Let us carry their quiet mystery with us as we move forward into spaces where warmth was more abundant, but no less carefully guarded. The stones teach us, if we're willing to learn, about the relationship between need and care, between hardship and small comforts, between the material and the meaningful. They show us how people made do, how they cared for each other through simple acts of practical kindness, how they survived long winters with nothing more than a heated stone and the knowledge that someone had warmed it for them. In each smooth surface, each carved initial, each crack carefully repaired with wire, we can read a story of resilience and tenderness. These are not the grand narratives of history, not the stories of kings and battles and great social movements. They are quieter stories, harder to hear, but no less important. They tell us how ordinary people lived, what they valued, how they made their way through difficult times with whatever resources they had. The warming stone is democratic in its simplicity. Rich and poor alike needed warmth, and while the quality of their stones might differ, the fundamental comfort was the same. Heat is heat, whether provided by smooth soapstone or rough river rock, and cold hands warm equally well around either. This universality of need and the various means of meeting it reveals something essential about human experience. We are all, regardless of status or circumstance, bound by the same basic requirements: warmth, shelter, food, care. The next time you adjust your thermostat without thinking, consider the warming stone. Consider the person who heated it by the fire, wrapped it carefully, tucked it into a pocket or a bed. Consider the hours of warmth it provided, the comfort of that gradual release of heat, the knowledge that someone had taken time to prepare this small gift of warmth. Consider how much effort went into something we now accomplish with a gesture, how much care was embedded in what we take for granted. The warming stones are not merely historical curiosities or archaeological puzzles. They are reminders of how recently our relationship with comfort has changed, how different daily life was for people separated from us by only a few generations. They invite us to reflect on what we've gained in convenience and what we might have lost in the process. The intimate knowledge of how warmth is made, The deliberate acts of care that accompanied its provision, the deep appreciation for comfort that comes from knowing its scarcity. These small stones carried warmth across cold streets, but they also carried something more, the warmth of human connection, of care, made tangible, of love, expressed through practical action. And in that sense they remain as warm today as they ever were, holding heat not in their physical mass, but in the human stories they embody. Stories of mothers and children, of neighbors helping neighbors, of people finding small ways to make hard lives a little more bearable. Stories of warmth in all its forms, carefully tended, gratefully received, remembered long after the stones themselves grew cold. This is the real mystery of warming stones, not how they were used, though that remains incompletely understood, but what they meant to the people who used them. The stones themselves are just stones, inert matter shaped by human hands. But the meanings invested in them, the care they represented, the comfort they provided, these are the qualities that transform simple objects into artifacts worth preserving, worth studying, worth trying to understand across the gulf of time that separates us from their users. They stand as small monuments to the ordinary struggles and kindnesses of ordinary life, to the ways people have always found to care for each other in difficult times. In museum collections and archaeological reports, in scholarly papers and careful measurements, they wait, silent, smooth, cool to the touch. They wait for us to imagine them warm again, to feel in our minds what hands once felt in reality, to understand through imagination what documentation failed to record. They wait for us to recognize in them not just historical artifacts, but mirrors reflecting back our own needs, our own capacity for care, our own eternal struggle to stay warm in a cold world. And perhaps in that recognition we come closer to understanding not just the stones themselves, but the people who made them, used them, cherished them. People who were not so different from us, who loved and worried and tried to protect those they cared about from hardship. People who found in heated stones wrapped in cloth a way to send warmth and comfort out into the world, carried by the ones they loved. The stones remain cool and mysterious, but the warmth they once held still echoes through time, reaching us across the years, inviting us to remember, to imagine, to understand. From the mystery of small stones and ordinary struggles, let us now ascend into another world entirely, one where warmth was not rationed but abundant, where cold was an annoyance rather than a constant threat. In the grand town houses of London's West End and the sprawling country estates that dotted the English countryside, winter arrived with less menace and more ceremony. These were homes built to contain warmth, designed with thick walls and heavy draperies, with wood panelling that held heat and carpets that insulated floors from the cold beneath. Here, in rooms lit by dozens of candles and warmed by roaring fires, the Victorian elite conducted their lives in a comfort that would have seemed fantastical to the Manchester labourer shivering in his two-room dwelling. But comfort, even among the wealthy, was never effortless. It required constant labour, careful management, and an invisible workforce whose own comfort was rarely considered. Let us drift through these warm spaces slowly, observing the rituals of privilege, the mechanics of luxury, and the quiet contradictions that existed even in homes that seemed impervious to winter's reach. A typical grand Victorian home might contain 30 or more fireplaces, sometimes as many as 50 in the largest estates. Each room of consequence had its own hearth, drawing rooms, dining rooms, libraries, bedrooms, even some hallways and corridors. These were not the simple iron grates of working-class homes, but elaborate constructions of marble and cast iron, decorated with tiles, surrounded by carved mantels that proclaimed the owner's wealth and taste. The fireplaces in the main rooms were large enough that a child could stand inside them, designed to burn massive logs and project heat deep into spacious chambers. The sheer scale of these heating systems reflected an approach to comfort that was fundamentally different from that of ordinary households. Where a working-class family might huddle around a single fire, moving closer or farther based on need, wealthy families distributed heat throughout their homes with a prodigality that bordered on the theatrical. The coal cellars beneath these houses were vast, holding tons of fuel that would be consumed over a single winter. While a working-class family might struggle to afford a few sacks of coal each week, wealthy households bought coal by the cartload, storing it in dry underground chambers where servants could access it without tracking dirt through the main house. The procurement of coal was handled by stewards and housekeepers, negotiations conducted with suppliers who knew their clients would pay premium prices for the highest quality fuel, coal that burned hot and clean, with minimal smoke and ash. This was not the cheap, sulphurous coal that filled the air of industrial neighborhoods, but carefully selected anthracite or the best bituminous coal, shipped from specific mines known for their superior product. Some estates maintained relationships with particular coal merchants spanning decades, loyalty rewarded with first access to the finest shipments. The coal trade for elite households was conducted with the same attention to quality and provenance that marked the purchase of fine wines or imported fabrics. The difference between coal types mattered greatly in elite homes. Poor coal produced acrid smoke that stained walls and fabrics, that left residue on fine furniture and irritated delicate lungs. Good coal burned cleaner, hotter, longer, making it worth the extra expense for families who could afford to be particular. This attention to detail extended to every aspect of heating: the quality of firewood, the design of grates, the management of chimney drafts. Housekeepers maintained detailed records of coal consumption, tracking which types burned best in different fireplaces, noting seasonal variations in quality. These records formed institutional knowledge passed between generations of servants, documenting the peculiarities of each house's heating systems with scientific precision. Inside these warm houses, the experience of winter was transformed. Walking from room to room meant moving through spaces that were consistently comfortable, where the air itself felt softer, less hostile. Thick wool carpets covered the floors, their pile deep enough to cushion footsteps and provide insulation from cold stones beneath. Heavy curtains hung at every window, velvet or brocade in rich colors, drawn closed at dusk to trap heat inside and block drafts from ill-fitting window frames. The curtains themselves were marvels of domestic engineering, often lined with multiple layers of fabric, sometimes interlined with flannel or wool batting. When drawn, they created air pockets that further insulated against the cold, transforming windows from sources of heat loss into merely neutral elements of the room's thermal envelope. The walls themselves were barriers against cold, solid brick or stone, often 2 feet thick, plastered and papered, sometimes paneled in wood that added another layer of insulation. In the most elaborate homes, double doors created airlocks between rooms, preventing heat from escaping when servants moved through the house. These architectural features, combined with constant fires, created microclimates of warmth that could sustain tropical plants even in the depths of winter. Conservatories attached to grand houses were kept warm enough for palms and orchids, humidity maintained through careful attention, creating little pockets of summer inside the frozen English landscape. The conservatories represented the ultimate triumph of wealth over climate, spaces where nature itself could be commanded to behave according to human desires. Exotic plants from India, Africa, South America flourished in these glass-enclosed rooms, their presence a statement about empire, control, and the reach of British power. But this warmth did not maintain itself. It required an army of servants whose labor began before dawn and continued long after the family had retired for the night. The management of household fires was a complex choreography involving multiple servants, each with specific responsibilities, all coordinated to ensure that warmth appeared effortlessly, as if by magic. The lowest-ranking servants, often young girls barely into their teens, rose first, sometimes as early as 4 in the morning, in the depths of winter. Their first task was to descend into the cold parts of the house, the basement and service areas where fires had died overnight, and begin the day's heating. In the pre-dawn darkness, these young servants moved through silent corridors, their candles casting flickering shadows on walls. The house at this hour was a different place entirely, cold and hollow, stripped of the warmth and life that would animate it once the family woke. They cleaned out yesterday's ashes from the main fireplaces, carrying heavy buckets through dim corridors, their hands already rough from earlier work. The ashes were sorted, some reused for cleaning, others sold to soap makers or farmers, nothing wasted in the efficient economy of a great house. The ash trade formed a small economy within the larger household, with servants sometimes receiving a portion of the proceeds from ash sales. These modest sums might be the only money some servants earned beyond room and board, making the dirty work of ash collection marginally more tolerable. Next came the laying of new fires, a skilled task despite its apparent simplicity. Paper and kindling arranged just so, coal added in the right quantities and positions to ensure even burning. Each fireplace had its peculiarities. This one drew well in east winds but smoked in west winds. That one needed extra kindling. Another required careful adjustment of the damper. The servants learned these quirks through experience, through scoldings when fires smoked or failed to catch, through the relentless repetition of daily practice. A housemaid who could lay a fire that caught on the first match, that burned evenly without smoking, that required minimal tending throughout the day, was valuable in ways that transcended her formal position. Such skills meant the difference between a smoothly running household and one plagued by cold rooms and irritable family members. By the time the family woke, fires blazed in bedrooms, dressing rooms, and breakfast rooms, the house transformed from the cold shell it had been at dawn into a warm nest of comfort. The family never witnessed the frantic early morning activity, never saw the servants hauling coal and ash, never felt the cold that preceded the warmth they took for granted. This invisibility was crucial to the illusion of effortless comfort that defined elite domestic life. The goal was to create an experience where warmth simply existed, appearing without apparent cause, maintained without visible effort. Throughout the day, servants moved through the house like ghosts, adding coal to fires, adjusting dampers, sweeping hearths, ensuring that warmth continued uninterrupted. In the largest houses, 1 or 2 servants might be assigned exclusively to fire management, their entire day consumed with maintaining heat. They carried coal in brass or copper scuttles, elegant containers that could be seen in public rooms, along with decorative fire irons and brass-handled bellows. These tools were as much display pieces as functional items, their shine maintained through constant polishing, another task for servants who existed to make comfort appear effortless. The polishing itself was endless work, as brass and copper tarnished quickly in the coal smoke atmosphere of Victorian homes. Servants used special pastes and powders, rubbing until their arms ached, transforming dull metal into mirror-bright surfaces that reflected firelight and proclaimed the household standards. The irony, of course, was that these servants often lived and slept in the coldest parts of the house. Their quarters were typically in the attic or basement, unheated rooms where winter pressed in with the same intensity it did in working-class tenements. A housemaid might spend her day maintaining fires in rooms heated to a comfortable 70 degrees, only to retreat at night to an attic room where her breath misted and ice formed on the inside of the windows. She might wrap herself in thin blankets on a narrow bed, shivering through the same cold that the Manchester labourer knew so well, despite living in a house that contained more warmth than most people would experience in their lifetimes. Some servants shared beds to conserve warmth, sleeping 2 or 3 to a narrow frame, cooling their body heat against the cold. Others stuffed newspapers into cracks around windows, hung blankets over doors, employed all the desperate measures of poverty, even while surrounded by unprecedented wealth. This contrast, creating comfort they could not share, defined the servants' experience of warmth in great houses. They knew intimately how warmth was made, how much labor it required, how carefully it must be maintained, yet they themselves were excluded from enjoying it except in passing while working. For the family and their guests, the rhythm of warmth followed different patterns, organized around social rituals that both required and celebrated heat. The drawing room fire became the center of afternoon gatherings, the focal point around which chairs were arranged and conversations flowed. Tea was served by the fire, delicate cups and silver services glinting in the firelight, the warmth allowing ladies to wear lighter dresses than would have been possible in colder homes. The library fire invited solitary reading, leather chairs positioned to catch both warmth and light, creating spaces of intimate comfort within larger spaces. These carefully arranged scenes of domestic comfort were as choreographed as any theatrical performance, with warmth playing a supporting role that enabled the main action. The fire provided not just heat, but atmosphere, a living element that animated the room and gave it focal purpose. Dinner parties in the dining room required careful calibration of warmth. Too cold and guests would be uncomfortable. Too hot, and the combination of fire, candles, and body heat from assembled guests would become oppressive. Servants learned to adjust fires throughout the evening, reading the room's temperature and the guests' comfort, adding or withholding cold to maintain the perfect balance. This was skilled work, requiring attention and judgment, yet it went unacknowledged because the mark of good service was invisibility. Experienced servants developed an almost intuitive sense for thermal management, noticing when guests began fanning themselves or when ladies drew their shawls closer. They adjusted fires without being asked, anticipating needs before they became problems, maintaining comfort so seamlessly that no one noticed anything at all. The bedtime ritual in wealthy homes involved preparations that working-class families could scarcely imagine. Before family members retired, servants would enter bedrooms to prepare them for sleep, lighting or refreshing fires, closing curtains, and deploying additional heating measures that seemed almost decadent in their thoroughness. Copper bedpans filled with hot coals or hot water were slipped between the sheets, warming the bed from within. Some families used ceramic bottles filled with boiling water, stoppered tightly and wrapped in flannel, placed at the foot of the bed to warm cold feet. The finest homes employed bed-warming pans, long-handled copper pans filled with hot coals that servants would run between the sheets in smooth motions, heating the fabric without scorching it. This required practice to perfect. Too slow, and you didn't warm the bed adequately. Too fast, and you created hot spots. Too much pressure, and you risked leaving coal marks on expensive linens. Young servants often practiced on their own beds first, learning the technique on cheap sheets before being trusted with the family's fine Irish linen. The skill was passed from senior servants to junior ones, a craft tradition within domestic service. By the time a family member climbed into bed, it was warm, comfortable, the sheets preheated, the room temperature maintained by a fire that would burn low through the night. Some families kept servants on call to refresh bedroom fires in the middle of the night if the cold became too intense, though this was considered excessive even among the wealthy. The night bells that connected bedrooms to servants' quarters could summon assistance at any hour, though servants dreaded the sound of a bell after midnight. It meant dressing quickly, descending from cold attics, rekindling fires, or fetching additional blankets, then climbing back to bed, only to be woken again at 4 to begin the day's work. Yet even in these bastions of warmth, winter could not be completely defeated. Despite thick walls and multiple fires, some rooms remained cold. Some corners of even the grandest houses never quite warmed. Corridors between heated rooms could be frigid, requiring residents to move quickly from one warm space to another. Bathrooms, which were beginning to appear in newer Victorian homes, were notoriously cold. Plumbing technology was primitive, heating pipes often froze, and the marble and porcelain fixtures that signaled modernity were excellent conductors of cold. The new bathrooms, touted as symbols of progress and hygiene, often became sources of misery in winter. Marble floors froze feet, porcelain toilets were painful to sit on, and the metal pipes groaned and sometimes burst when temperatures dropped. Wealthy families dealt with frozen pipes just as poorer families did, though they had servants to handle the crisis and resources to repair the damage. Water mains burst in cellars, flooding expensive wine collections. Ice formed in toilet bowls despite nearby fires. The humiliation of these failures was acute for families who prided themselves on their home's modernity and comfort. To have guests witness a plumbing failure was to reveal the limits of wealth's power over nature. Some families gave up on winter bathing entirely, returning to the old practice of sponge baths in bedrooms where portable stoves could be brought in. Progress, it turned out, was not linear, and modern conveniences sometimes created new problems while solving old ones. Even fireplaces, despite their abundance and quality, had inherent problems that wealth could not solve. Chimneys in grand houses were complex systems, flues stacked upon flues, multiple fireplaces sharing common structures. When winds shifted or weather changed, smoke could be pushed back down unused chimneys, filling rooms with acrid clouds that drove inhabitants away. Architects and builders struggled with these problems throughout the Victorian era, designing elaborate cowls and caps, experimenting with different chimney heights and orientations, trying to coax smoke to behave predictably. The science of chimney design became increasingly sophisticated, with engineers publishing treatises on draft calculations, flue proportions, and cap geometries. Yet theory and practice diverged frustratingly, with chimneys that should have worked perfectly on paper, smoking abominably in reality. Some great houses were notorious for their smoking problems, entire wings abandoned during certain weather conditions, rooms closed off because no amount of tinkering could make the chimneys draw properly. These were humiliating failures, expensive problems that persisted despite the best efforts of engineers and architects, reminders that even the wealthy remained subject to forces beyond their control. Families developed elaborate workarounds for problematic chimneys, using certain rooms only when wind came from particular directions, closing off fireplaces that smoked and relying on adjacent ones. These compromises undermined the fantasy of complete control that wealth was supposed to provide. The decorative aspects of elite heating were as important as the functional ones. Fireplaces were surrounded by elaborate mantles carved from marble, slate, or wood, often imported from Italy or France at great expense. The surrounds were decorated with tiles depicting pastoral scenes, mythological figures, or abstract patterns, each room's fireplace designed to complement the room's overall aesthetic. Cast iron grates were works of art, their backs decorated with heraldic symbols, floral patterns, or scenes from literature. Some firebacks were commissioned specifically for individual families, bearing their coats of arms or commemorating important family events. These personalized elements transformed functional heating equipment into statements of lineage and identity. Fire screens stood nearby, decorative panels on stands that could be positioned to block direct heat from faces while allowing warmth to circulate. Ladies' complexions were considered delicate, and the direct heat of a fire could cause redness or discomfort. These screens were often needlework masterpieces, silk or wool embroidered with intricate designs as much about display as function. The creation of fire screens became an acceptable artistic outlet for women of leisure who spent months embroidering elaborate designs. These screens were displayed prominently, their artistry a reflection of the maker's refinement and skill. The tools of fire maintenance became opportunities for craftsmanship and display. Brass pokers, tongs, and shovels hung from elaborate stands, their handles carved or decorated, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness. Bellows might be decorated with painted scenes or inlaid with mother of pearl. Coal scuttles in main rooms were copper or brass, ornately decorated, designed to be seen and admired rather than hidden away. This aestheticization of heating, this transformation of functional objects into decorative elements, revealed the elite's relationship with warmth. It was not merely a necessity, but a symbol of refinement, a marker of civilization and culture. The beauty of the heating apparatus reinforced social hierarchies. We are people, these objects declared, who do not merely survive winter, but transform it into an opportunity for elegance. Social rituals evolved around these warm spaces, structured by the availability and distribution of heat. Morning visits were conducted in the drawing room by the fire. Afternoon calls followed similar patterns, guests and hosts arranging themselves in hierarchical proximity to the warmth, the most honored guests closest to the fire, others radiating outward in unspoken order. These spatial arrangements reinforced social positions while seeming merely practical. Elderly guests, or those of higher social rank, naturally gravitated toward the best positions near the fire, while younger or lower status visitors took seats farther away. This geography of warmth mapped social relationships onto physical space, making hierarchy visible and felt. Evening entertainments in winter centered on warm rooms, musicales in heated drawing rooms, card games in libraries where fires crackled in carved hearths, dinner parties where the dining room was brought to perfect temperature through careful preparation. Cold rooms, even in warm houses, were abandoned in winter, left unused until spring brought warmth that required no fuel. The contrast between warm and cold spaces created internal geographies within great houses, winter territories that shifted with the seasons. Families migrated through their own homes, following warmth, abandoning less essential spaces to the cold, returning when weather permitted. Some rooms were opened only for specific occasions, their holland covers removed, fires lit for the first time in months, the cold dispelled through hours of heating. The reopening of a ballroom for a winter party required days of preparation, servants working to warm the massive space to comfortable temperatures. But beneath the comfort and ritual, beneath the elegant fires and warm rooms, lay a fundamental truth that even wealth could not entirely obscure. Warmth was work. It required constant effort, continuous attention, endless labor that someone had to perform. The difference between rich and poor was not that the wealthy had discovered a way to eliminate this work, but that they had the resources to pay others to do it for them. The fires that warmed drawing rooms and bedrooms were lit by servants who rose in darkness. The coal that burned so cleanly was hauled by servants who breathed its dust. The comfort that seemed so natural, so effortless, was built on invisible foundations of other people's labor, other people's cold nights, other people's aching hands. This was perhaps the deepest privilege of wealth, not the warmth itself, which anyone with enough coal could theoretically achieve, but the illusion that warmth simply existed, that it required no effort, that comfort was the natural state of things rather than something constantly created and maintained through human toil. The wealthy could believe that their warm homes reflected their own virtue, their good management, their superior position in society's hierarchy. They could forget or never know that their comfort depended on others' discomfort, that the servants who maintained their warmth often shivered in unheated attics, that the coal that burned in their elaborate grates was mined by men who died young from lung disease, that every luxury they enjoyed was built on structures of inequality that seemed as natural and inevitable as the seasons themselves. The moral architecture of these arrangements went largely unquestioned, embedded in assumptions about class, service, and natural order. That some people should work so others could be comfortable seemed as obvious as the need for warmth itself. Yet even the wealthy were not immune to winter's reach, not completely. Illness struck mansions as well as tenements. Influenza and pneumonia cared nothing for social class, though good nutrition and warm houses improved survival rates. Children in great houses caught colds despite fires and warm clothing. Elderly family members struggled with circulation, joints that ached despite the warmth, bodies that failed despite every advantage. The finest doctors attended wealthy patients, but medical knowledge remained limited, treatments often ineffective. A child with pneumonia might die in a warm bedroom attended by specialists, while another child in identical circumstances survived. The randomness of illness respected no social boundaries. Death came to warm rooms as well as cold ones, sometimes softly, in sleep by a banked fire, sometimes suddenly in the middle of winter, despite every comfort wealth could provide. The wealthy were insulated from many of winter's hardships, but they could not escape winter entirely. They could only make its passage more comfortable, its presence less threatening. And there was, perhaps, a certain fragility to elite warmth, a dependence on systems that could fail. Houses that relied on dozens of fires required constant fuel and constant labor. If servants fell ill or supplies ran short, the elaborate comfort collapsed quickly. The wealthy family that took warmth for granted could find themselves suddenly cold, their comfort revealed as contingent rather than guaranteed, dependent on circumstances beyond their control. This rarely happened, but the possibility existed, a small shadow on even the warmest hearth. During particularly severe winters, even coal merchants to the wealthy faced shortages, and elite households found themselves competing for limited supplies. The disruption to their accustomed comfort could be profound, revealing how thin the veneer of invulnerability really was. As the Victorian era progressed, some wealthy homes began installing the radiator systems that Franz San Galli and others had pioneered. These early central heating systems were expensive, often unreliable, requiring constant maintenance and adjustment. But they represented a new possibility, warmth that required less visible labor, that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves rather than from discrete fires that needed tending. The transition was gradual, incomplete during the Victorian period, but it pointed toward a future where warmth might be truly effortless, where the push of a button or the turn of a dial would replace the endless hauling of coal and tending of fires. The early radiators were temperamental machines, prone to mysterious failures and uneven heating. Some rooms became uncomfortably hot while others remained cold, the system's logic opaque even to the engineers who installed it. Yet even as technology promised to democratize comfort, to make warmth available to everyone regardless of wealth or status, the Victorian elite held on to their fireplaces, their rituals, their visible displays of warmth and luxury. There was something about the presence of fire, the sight of flames, the sound of burning coal that technology could not fully replace. A radiator might provide superior heat, but it lacked the aesthetic and social dimensions of a fire. It could not serve as the center of a room, could not gather people around it, could not provide the visual beauty that made warmth seem like more than mere temperature. The fire offered spectacle, drama, a living element that changed moment to moment, commanding attention in ways that a silent radiator never could. It was entertainment as well as utility, a focal point for contemplation and conversation. So even progressive households kept their main fireplaces, using them for show and atmosphere, even when radiators did the real work of heating. The fire became theatre, performance, a symbol disconnected from its original function, but still valued for what it represented: civilization, culture, the mastery of nature, the transformation of necessity into luxury. And perhaps that transformation captures something essential about the elite experience of Victorian heating. They took what was, for most people, a desperate struggle for survival, the daily battle to stay warm, and transformed it into a set of refined rituals and aesthetic experiences. They turned necessity into culture, survival into elegance, creating a world where warmth was not merely achieved but celebrated, displayed, used to mark social boundaries and reinforce hierarchies. This was privilege in its purest form, not just having more, but having so much that you could afford to make it beautiful, to make it meaningful in ways that transcended mere function. The elaboration of heating into an art form revealed something profound about wealth's relationship to basic needs. Once survival was assured, once warmth was abundant, it could be transformed into something more, a statement, a performance, an identity. As we drift away from these warm rooms, from the glow of 30 fireplaces and the invisible labor that sustained them, we carry with us an understanding of how profoundly unequal the experience of warmth could be. The same coal that heated great houses also heated humble ones, but the distance between those experiences was vast, not just in degree but in kind. For some, warmth was rationed, fought for, never quite sufficient. For others, it was abundant, reliable, the foundation upon which comfort and culture could be built. The geography of warmth in Victorian England was not merely physical, but social, economic, political. It mapped power onto space, making visible the structures that determined who would be comfortable and who would suffer. The story of Victorian heating is not just about technology or fuel or architectural design, it's about who had access to comfort and who did not, about the invisible labor that created visible luxury, about the thousand small ways that class and wealth shaped the most basic experience of human life. Winter came to everyone, but it did not come equally, and the warmth that pushed it back was distributed according to logics that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with power. Let us hold that knowledge gently as we move toward our conclusion, as we reflect on how far we have come and what has been lost and gained in the journey from Victorian cold to modern comfort. The grand houses with their 30 fireplaces belong to history now, preserved as museums or converted to other uses, their coal cellars empty, their elaborate heating systems artifacts of a vanished world. And so we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through the cold world of Victorian Britain, a world that seems both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. We have walked through frozen mornings in Manchester row houses, felt the weight of damp clothes and the sting of icy air, known the resignation of facing another day in the endless grip of winter. We have followed Franz San Galli through his patient decades of work, watched him bend over pipes and radiators in a dim St. Petersburg workshop, understood his quiet hope that warmth might someday reach everyone who needed it. We have held mysterious warming stones in our imagination, felt their smooth weight, wondered about the hands that carved them and the people who carried them close against the cold. And we have drifted through the warm rooms of great houses, witnessed the invisible labor that sustained impossible comfort, seen how profoundly unequal the simple experience of warmth could be. 4 segments, 4 windows into the same fundamental human struggle, the ancient, endless battle to transform cold into warmth, to create comfort in a world that offers none freely. What strikes us now, perhaps, is how recently all of this was true. The year 1874 is not ancient history. It is only 5 or 6 generations removed from our present moment. Your great-great-grandparents, or their parents, may have lived through winters like the ones we have described, may have woken to frozen water jugs and lit fires with numb fingers, may have known cold as a constant presence rather than an occasional inconvenience. The distance between their world and ours is measured not in centuries, but in decades, a handful of human lifetimes spanning an immense transformation in how we live. Consider for a moment the room where you are now, listening to these words. Perhaps you are warm, comfortable, the air around you maintained at a pleasant temperature by systems you barely notice. A thermostat on the wall, adjusted with a touch or a voice command, controls heating that flows invisibly through vents or radiators or underfloor pipes. You give it no thought because it requires no thought. Warmth simply exists, as automatic and reliable as the sunrise. Or perhaps you are cold right now, but by choice rather than necessity. Windows open to fresh air, blankets pulled close because you prefer their weight and texture. Even your cold is different from Victorian cold, optional rather than mandatory, escapable with a few simple actions rather than hours of labor. The contrast is almost incomprehensible. We live in a world that the Victorian laborer could scarcely have imagined, where warmth is so abundant and accessible that we can afford to ignore it, to take it completely for granted, to never think about the miracle of not being cold. The transformation that brought us here was not simple or sudden. It was built on the work of countless people, inventors like Franz San Galli, engineers who refined and improved heating systems, workers who manufactured the components, installers who brought the systems into homes, fuel suppliers who ensured constant supply. It required changes in manufacturing that made components affordable, economic shifts that increased wages enough that ordinary people could afford modern heating, social movements that demanded better living conditions for workers, and government policies that set standards and regulated safety. A century of incremental changes, each building on the last, until the impossible became routine. But something was lost in that transformation, even as so much was gained. We have lost the intimate relationship with warmth that our ancestors had, the daily awareness of how fragile comfort is, how much work it requires, how precious it can be. We have lost the rituals around fires, the gathering together for warmth, the small kindnesses of heating stones for each other, the shared understanding of struggle that bound people together. We have gained comfort and lost some kinds of connection, gained efficiency and lost some kinds of meaning. This is not to romanticize Victorian cold. There is nothing noble about suffering, nothing beautiful about children shivering in unheated rooms, nothing worth preserving in the desperate struggle to afford enough coal. The past was often brutal, uncomfortable, unfair in ways that should never be celebrated or wished back. But there is value in remembering, in understanding what came before, in recognizing that our current comfort is neither natural nor guaranteed, but something that had to be created, that someone had to imagine and build and fight for. Every time you adjust a thermostat without thinking, you are the beneficiary of Franz San Galli's cold workshop experiments, of servants' invisible labor, of working-class movements that demanded better conditions, of 100 years of slow progress toward the radical idea that everyone deserves to be warm. The warming stones we explored, those mysterious objects that may or may not have carried meanings we can no longer fully decode, remind us that warmth has always been about more than temperature. It has been about care, about connection, about the ways we show love through practical actions. When a Victorian mother warmed a stone for her child, she was not just providing heat, she was providing comfort in its fullest sense, physical and emotional together. We still do this in different ways. We adjust thermostats before guests arrive. We offer blankets to cold friends. We create warm spaces that welcome and comfort. The forms have changed, but the impulse remains, that deep human desire to make others comfortable, to share the warmth we have, to ease the struggles of the people we care about. Perhaps that is the thread that connects us to those Victorian lives. Across all the changes and transformations, we still understand at some fundamental level what it means to want warmth and to want it for others. The inequality we observed in Victorian heating, The vast gulf between the Manchester labourer and the elite family in their mansion has not entirely disappeared. Even today, in our world of abundant heating technology, not everyone has equal access to comfort. Some people still struggle to afford heating bills, still make impossible choices between warmth and other necessities, still know cold as a constant presence rather than an occasional inconvenience. The technology exists to keep everyone warm, but access remains unequal, shaped by economics and social structures that echo the Victorian world more than we might like to admit. This is worth remembering, worth holding in mind as we drift towards sleep. Our comfort is not universal, not yet, perhaps not ever. The work Franz San Galli began, the dream of warmth for everyone, remains incomplete. Progress has been real and significant. Far more people are warm today than in 1874, but the journey continues and the destination remains ahead. As you lie in your bed tonight, in sheets that require no warming pans, in a room that maintains its temperature without your effort or attention, think for just a moment about the people who made this possible. Think about the labourers in Victorian factories who built the early radiators and pipes, about the inventors who persisted through failure after failure, about the activists who demanded better living conditions, about all the anonymous people whose work, whose suffering, whose small innovations contributed to the comfort you now enjoy. They could not have imagined your world, but they helped create it, one small step at a time, one problem solved, one life made slightly more comfortable. You are the answer to Victorian prayers, the fulfillment of hopes that seemed impossible, a person for whom warmth is so automatic, so reliable, that it requires no thought at all. And perhaps, as sleep begins to claim you, as your breathing slows and your thoughts drift and scatter, you can feel a strange gratitude for this simple thing, this unremarkable miracle of not being cold. The weight of your blankets is comfort rather than necessity, chosen rather than desperately needed. The air around you is gentle, neutral, making no demands on your body or your attention. You can simply rest, simply be, without fighting, without struggling, without the constant background noise of discomfort that shaped so many lives for so long. This is what all those people were working toward, this exact moment of peace and comfort, this effortless warmth that asks nothing of you but that you accept it and rest. They would be glad, perhaps, to know that someone, somewhere, someday, would simply be warm without thinking about it, would take for granted what they fought so hard to achieve. The coal dust has settled, the fires have all been banked, the servants have finished their invisible labour and retreated to their own cold rooms. But that world is gone now, or mostly gone, transformed into something those people would barely recognise. The struggles we have witnessed tonight are history, preserved in museums and archaeological reports, in occasional memories and stories passed down through families, but no longer the daily reality for most people in our part of the world. Winter still comes patient and inevitable, but it comes to homes that are ready, that can push it back with ease, that transform its threat into something manageable, even beautiful. Snow falls on houses with heating systems humming quietly in basements, on radiators that warm rooms without flames, on thermostats that maintain perfect temperatures while we sleep. The cold cannot reach you here, not tonight, not in the way it reached the people we have remembered. You are safe, warm, comfortable, insulated not just by walls and heating systems, but by time itself, by all the years and effort and progress that separate you from that colder world. Let that knowledge settle over you now, gentle as a blanket, soft as the warmth that surrounds you. You have travelled through Victorian Britain tonight, through cold mornings and patient innovation, through mysterious artifacts and warm elite spaces, but you have returned home to your own time, your own comfortable present. The journey is complete. The story is told, or as told as it can be, with the fragments that remain. And now there is nothing left to do but rest, to let your eyes close, to allow sleep to come as softly and inevitably as it must. The rhythm of your breathing slows, matches the slow rhythm of the words you have heard, the gentle pace of the story that has carried you through this quiet night. Somewhere, in a museum drawer, a warming stone sits silent, still holding its secrets, still waiting for hands that will never warm it again. Somewhere, in forgotten archives, Franz San Galli's patents gather dust, technical drawings of pipes and radiators that changed the world so thoroughly we no longer notice their revolution. Somewhere, in archaeological sites not yet excavated, evidence of Victorian cold waits to be discovered. Ash layers and coal stains, frozen pipes and inadequate grates, the physical record of ordinary suffering and extraordinary endurance. But these are concerns for tomorrow, for daylight, for the waking world. Tonight, you need only rest. Let the weight of history lift from your shoulders. Let the cold recede into the past where it belongs. Let warmth hold you as gently as the darkness holds you now. The Manchester labourer has long since laid down his burdens. Franz San Galli's patient work is finished. The servants in the great houses have finally found their own rest. All the struggles we have witnessed have ended, all the fires have gone out, all the cold mornings have passed into memory and dust. And you, inheritor of their world, beneficiary of their labour, can simply sleep. Warm, comfortable, safe in ways they could only dream of. This is your gift from them across the years, this moment of peace, this effortless comfort, this quiet night where cold is not even a thought. Sleep now. Let the story fade, let the images dissolve, let the Victorian world recede back into the history from which we called it. Your breathing is slow and steady, your body is warm and relaxed, and sleep is very close now, waiting just beyond the edge of consciousness. Tomorrow you will wake to a warm house, to comfort that requires no effort, to a world they helped build but never saw. But tomorrow is far away. Tonight there is only this: warmth, darkness, the gentle drift towards sleep, and the quiet knowledge that you are comfortable in ways that once seemed impossible, that you are warm in a world that was once so very cold. Rest now. Let go. The story is over, the journey is complete, and sleep is here. Everything is warm, everything is quiet, everything is exactly as it should be. Good night.